Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and this week I want to talk about what is my hobby, or what is our hobby. So exactly what is the hobby? When we use the phrase of our hobby, it usually means something completely different to pretty much every wargamer that uses it. Companies like Battlefront and Games Workshop will often use the phrase the hobby to describe their vision of wargaming. It's a sort of shorthand that means their rules, their products, their followers, the dedicated players. But in the wider wargaming community, we all at one time or another use the phrase my hobby or our hobby to describe our particular obsession. There are different elements that make up the hobby, and each person will have a different balance for each of the different elements. The player, the painter, the blogger, the vlogger, the photographer, the tournament player, the social gamer, the rules writer, the designer, the terrain builder, and many, many more. So what is my hobby? It'll probably come as no surprise that I consider creating videos and writing for my blog to be an essential part of my hobby. I'm still a wargamer and a miniatures painter who enjoys the essential social element of wargaming. But for me, and for many others like me, I also enjoy expressing that enthusiasm for my hobby by interacting with other wargamers across different social media. It is true to say that if I wasn't blogging and vlogging, I could probably do more painting and gaming, but I definitely think that I would be missing out on something that I really enjoy. And I assume the fact that you're watching this video on a social media platform that you like YouTube, or either through YouTube or through my blog, and you probably also enjoy that aspect of the hobby to a greater or lesser extent. Everyone's enjoyment is going to be slightly different. Now, I've always thought that my hobby is a multidisciplinary activity. I've used that phrase many times. It is and always has been more than just gaming. When I started out in the early 80s playing role-playing games, I immediately started painting my first miniatures. And yes, as the years went by, my hobby evolved and I started wargaming and painting in a completely different way. And it wasn't long before I wanted to photograph and share what I was working on. And sharing via social media just felt like the perfect way to reach a broader audience and through them improve my painting skills. So when I started my blog back in 2009, it was just the next logical progression for me. Inevitably, this outward looking approach led to making connections with gamers across the globe and eventually to Postage Rejects and nearly 15 years of incredible wargaming with that group. A couple of weeks ago, I was a guest on Henry Hyde's Battle Chat podcast, and I explained how branching into blogging exploded the potential of my hobby. I instantly made a wider group of gaming friends, which, as I've already said, inevitably led me to becoming a member of Postage Rejects. This in turn massively broadened my horizons because I got to play games that I never would have done as a solo gamer. And I'm constantly learning from the people that I know online and from my fellow players in the Rejects. And I hope that that never ends, because that's one of the most enjoyable things about social media, learning from other hobbyists. Now, my hobby consists of a range of activities, not just wargaming, but it's a mix that I personally enjoy. But what about you? What shape and composition does your hobby take? Do you have one element that consumes more time than all the others, or do you see them all as just part of one larger pastime? As always, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. So now for a hobby update. This week I've spent a bit of time working on my Wars of the Roses Bosworth stuff. As I mentioned last week, I had a largish test game using part of my Bosworth collection and the test of resolve rules for a solo game here in my operations room. I'll include a link to the pictures and a write-up on my blog in the description below if you want to see more. Following the game, I realised that I needed to make a few adjustments to my map to give the battles a little bit more room to fit into the terrain, and I'll probably talk a bit more about that next Sunday. This has meant squeezing and reshaping some of the historical footprint of the battle, but the end result is a map that can still be recognised when looking at modern maps of the actual landscape. The next step is to play a few smaller test games to allow me to master the rules before I take this to the shed of war and unleash it on the Rejects. Now, I use the term master advisedly. I'm not that good at understanding or retaining rules in my head, but hopefully I'll avoid making a complete fool of myself when I run the game in front of other people. Now, looking at my workbench over the last week, I have done a little bit of painting, but not nearly as much as I normally do during the winter holiday. Just before Christmas I submitted my first entry to the Analog Hobbies painting challenge, and then spent nearly a week doing nothing really, not really getting any painting done. However, this week I have pushed on with the first of my mini projects for the challenge by revisiting my French North Africa project that I originally started in 2022. Now, I had bought several models to use as French civilians, archaeologists, diggers and the like, and some irregular soldiers and adventurers and that sort of thing. And I'd like to do a game where they are being defended from attack by the Foreign Legion. You know, think of the scene in March or Die towards the end of that film. That's what I'm aiming for. Now, most of the models are from the same manufacturer as the Foreign Legion troops, so Blue Moon, sold in the UK by Old Glory. However, there are also a couple of figures from Irregular in a collection as well. Now, I have to admit, restarting an old project has been a lot harder than I anticipated. I certainly wasn't feeling the painting mojo until I got over halfway through, and then suddenly I found my rhythm again. But I have used the momentum to bounce on to the next project, some tents and subsequently some buildings for my Wars of the Roses project. I want to use that momentum before I get bogged down again. Now, I wasn't intending on making movie reviews a regular part of this channel, and to be fair, I'm still not. However, I thought that Godzilla Minus One was worthy of a quick mention. The film has been out for a few weeks, so it's only still showing in a few cinemas, but the wife and I found it at a local venue, and so we went and saw it on Tuesday this week. Now, having tortured my senses with the Napoleon movie earlier in December, I was looking for something completely different to tempt the pair of us back into the cinema. Then I watched a quick review by Mark's Game Room, and again I'll put a link down in the description below, and I decided it was worth going to the cinema to watch this film, if only because they rated the historical aspects of the film quite highly. Now, a quick pre-warning to those that want to see the film: it is entirely in Japanese with subtitles, as you would expect from a film set entirely in Japan with entirely Japanese actors and made by a Japanese studio and written by a Japanese writer. I only emphasise this because at least one viewer in the cinema, when I was in there to see it, was clearly not impressed by the fact that they had to read subtitles through the whole of the movie. Now, I have to say I didn't find the subtitles intrusive at all, and it was easy to keep up with the dialogue and enjoy the cinematography at the same time. Maybe that was just easier because it was on a gigantic screen. I don't know, but it didn't bother me at all, and I thoroughly enjoyed the film regardless of the subtitles. I'll try and avoid any spoilers for those of you that haven't seen the movie yet, but I'm not giving much away by saying that the movie covers the period from the last days of World War II through to the late 40s in post-war Japan. And it is, of course, a fantasy sci-fi movie, but it was immediately apparent that there was a lot more attention to historical detail in this film than in my last cinema experience. All of the equipment used appeared to be historically accurate, from Zeros early in the film to uniforms and decommissioned Japanese destroyers, and even the appearance of a prototype Kyushu 7JW Shinden fighter plane. There was only a handful built, in fact there's only 2 surviving, and they built an entire replica for this film. And bear in mind, they did all of this on a budget of just $15 million compared to over $200 million that Ridley Scott squandered making a Napoleon. Now, while I of course enjoyed the historical aspects of the movie, it was the characters that made this a successful story. All the main characters had a backstory, but unlike so many Hollywood movies, they didn't have to spend half the film going into minute details. They all went through an emotional and psychological journey together during the course of this story, and like real people, they were complex and messy and not always perfect. All of the characters had their own personal conflicts linked to their experiences of World War II. And this film was as much about them dealing with those inner demons as much as they were dealing with Godzilla. They were frightened, flawed and vulnerable, but also brave and selfless in a way that felt completely realistic. And as the story grew to a climax, it was clear that they all wanted to live, but they were also prepared to die to protect the people they loved. This vulnerability made the audience invest in those characters in a way that is so often lacking in modern movie making. In short, the viewer cared about their fate. No character was cloaked in Hollywood invincibility, which just increased the tension in those moments of high danger. There was no need for the dialogue to include silly quips and jokes to show how brave these people were. We could see it in their frightened and determined faces. I think it's worth interjecting briefly to talk about historically and culturally appropriate social values for this period. The film was set in the late 40s Japan, and the social structures of the time, such as women largely being represented as homemakers, were accurately reflected in this movie. As far as I could tell, there was absolutely no attempt to crowbar in modern values, and there was no message being rammed down the audience's throats. This was a film about a giant irradiated lizard stomping on Japanese cities at the end of the day. If it had a message at all, it was about how people deal with the aftermath of war and defeat, and how in the face of unspeakable destruction they could still find the strength to sacrifice themselves for others. And while we're talking about giant irradiated lizards, I have to say that I personally enjoyed the fact that this was very much a classic Japanese Godzilla movie. There was mega destruction on citywide scales, attacks on innocent railway cars for no particular reason, and panicked civilians being squished left, right and centre. And at no time did the scriptwriter feel like they needed to waste time explaining why Godzilla was doing what he was doing. He just was. They understood that we don't need to know the monster's motivation, because at its heart this was a film about the human characters, not the monster. By cutting out pointless exposition, the filmmakers could devote more time to the characters and enhance the emotional investment of the audience. In short, this monster flick had more emotional intelligence in its script than most of the bigger budget Hollywood blockbusters have in many years. Now, if you want to see the film in the cinema, and I highly recommend doing so, it's so much better on a large screen, then you'll have to get a move on. It was released mid-December and it's already starting to be wound down in cinemas to make space for bigger budget but entirely vacuous Hollywood movies like Aquaman. If you want a good bit of old-fashioned escapism, a little bit of historical action and some top-notch storytelling, then this is a film worth seeking out. And incidentally, apparently they're also going to release a black and white version, which actually I think I would pay to see again, because this was such a good film. It would look like a classic Godzilla movie in black and white, and I think it would certainly enjoy my enjoyment of this film. So that's it for this week, and if you enjoyed the video, please join the conversation in the comments below. And of course, please like, subscribe and share. It really does help grow the channel and bring in new viewers. And don't forget that if you want to keep up to date with weekly content from this channel, please tap the bell notification icon. So until next week, stay safe, keep gaming, and of course, keep rolling high.